Here is part 1, written according to your specifications. ****. The Van der Linden mansion wasn't just a house. It was a statement. It sat on a hill, all old stone and gleaming windows, looking down on the city like a king on a throne. Tonight, its lights blazed brighter than ever, splashing gold across the manicured lawns. It was the night of the annual charity gala, the one event every person who was anyone marked on their calendar a year in advance. Inside, the air hummed. It wasn't just the sound of conversation and laughter, or the soft clink of crystal champagne flutes. It was a buzz of pure, expensive anticipation. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved like ghosts through the crowd, offering tiny, perfect bites of food that cost more than most people made in an hour. The women wore dresses that seemed spun from starlight and shadow, and the men looked polished and sharp in their black and white. They were all there, the whole glittering ecosystem of the city's elite, and they were all waiting for one thing, the main event. The crown jewel of Eleanor van der Linden's famous evening was always a performance. Last year, it was a world-famous opera singer. The year before, a cellist so gifted people said his instrument wept. This year, the talk had been relentless for months. She had secured him. Alexei Volkov, the pianist from Russia, with hands they said were insured for millions. His recordings sold out in minutes. To see him in a private home for just 50 people was the kind of privilege money usually couldn't buy. It was Eleanor's greatest coup. The grand piano, a majestic Steinway concert grand, sat on a small raised platform at the far end of the ballroom. It had been polished to a deep, liquid black, reflecting the light from the chandeliers above like still water. It was a sacred object tonight, waiting for its priest. Eleanor van der Linden stood near the French doors, a smile fixed on her face. She was the conductor of this symphony of society, and everything was hitting the right note. The flowers were perfect. The champagne was perfectly chilled. The compliments floated toward her like butterflies. "Eleanor, you've outdone yourself. Simply magical." She accepted them with a graceful nod, but her eyes kept flicking towards the clock. Volkov was to arrive at 8 for a 9 o'clock performance. It was 10 past 8. A tiny thread of worry began to weave itself into her stomach. Down in the staff quarters, a different kind of preparation was happening. It was all quiet efficiency and practiced motions. The head butler, a man with a spine so straight it seemed he was born with a book balanced on his head, checked his team with a critical eye. "Spotless," he murmured. "Everything must be spotless." Among the staff was a woman named Lena. She was in her late 50s, with hair the color of steel pulled back into a simple, tight bun. Her hands, which were almost always in motion, were rough from work, but moved with a strange, careful grace. She didn't talk much. She did her job. Tonight, her job was to tend to the music room, and most importantly, the instrument itself. While the guests sipped and laughed upstairs, Lena was in the ballroom, alone with the giant piano. She carried a soft, lint-free cloth and a bottle of specially formulated polish. She didn't just wipe the surface. She cared for it. Her hands moved over the ebony wood with a tenderness that was absent from her usual scrubbing and dusting. She checked the bench for stability. She opened the lid and peered inside at the intricate forest of strings and hammers, not to play, but to ensure no dust had dared to settle. To her, this wasn't just a piece of furniture for rich people to show off. It was a living thing, asleep and waiting. She ran a finger along the edge of a key, not pressing it down. A faint ghost of a memory flickered in her eyes, gone as quickly as it came. The head butler appeared in the doorway. "Lena, nearly finished. Mr. Volkov will be here for his tuning and warm-up shortly. Be sure you are done and invisible." Lena gave a single silent nod. Back upstairs, the thread of worry in Eleanor's stomach was pulling tighter. It was 8:30. Her personal assistant, a young man with a tablet glued to his hand, looked pale as he weaved through the crowd toward her. He leaned in, his voice a tense whisper. "Ma'am, Mr. Volkov's manager is on the line. He says it's urgent." Eleanor's perfect smile didn't move, but her eyes turned to ice. "Excuse me," she said to the couple she was speaking to, her voice like honey. She moved to a secluded alcove, took the phone, and pressed it to her ear. "This is Eleanor." The voice on the other end was a frantic, apologetic stream. "Mrs. van der Linden, deepest, most profound apologies. Alexei, he is devastated. A fever, a sudden, terrible fever. He cannot stand. The doctor is with him now. He cannot possibly perform. We are so sorry." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. Fever, cannot perform. The room, for a second, seemed to tilt. She saw the whole evening crumbling. The triumph turning into a humiliating joke. All these people expecting a genius, and she would have nothing to give them but canapes and excuses. Her reputation, built over decades, would become the story of the party that failed. "No," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "This is not acceptable. There must be a solution. A replacement. Someone. At this hour? On this night? There is no one, madam. No one of his caliber. It is impossible." The call ended. Eleanor stood in the alcove, the phone limp in her hand. The buzz of the party now sounded like the roar of an approaching wave. She had to go back out there. She had to tell them. She could already see the looks, the pity, the hidden smirks, the quiet satisfaction from her rivals. Her mind raced in desperate, frantic circles. She walked back into the main room, her face a mask of calm. But her eyes were hunting, scanning her surroundings for anything, any idea. They swept over the priceless art, the ice sculptures, the waiters. And then they landed on the doorway to the ballroom. Just visible from where she stood, she could see the piano. And she could see a figure in a simple gray maid's dress, bent over it, giving the instrument one final, loving pass with a cloth-dotted idea, absurd and desperate, bloomed in Eleanor's panic-stricken mind. It was crazy. It was beneath them all. But it was the only thing she had. She moved, cutting through the crowd with a new, sharp purpose. She entered the ballroom just as Lena was gathering her cleaning supplies, her task complete. "You," Eleanor said, the words snapping out like a whip. Lena straightened up, her expression neutral, waiting for an order. "The pianist," Eleanor said, the words coming in a rushed, low torrent. "He's ill. He can't come. I need you to sit at the piano." Lena blinked, slowly. A faint line of confusion appeared between her brows. "Not to play," Eleanor hissed, stepping closer, her voice dropping so the few staff members nearby couldn't hear. "Just to sit. You work in here. You must know how it looks. You can read music, yes? You can follow along on the sheet? Just put your hands on the keys and move them. We'll announce it as a modern artistic statement. A performance of absence. It will be avant-garde. It will save the evening." She was talking faster now, convincing herself as much as she was trying to convince the maid. "It's simple. You just sit there for 20 minutes. You move your hands. You don't make a sound. Then you get up and leave. No one will blame you. They'll think it's my bold artistic choice." Lena stared at her. In her eyes, there was a deep, slow-moving storm of emotions. Disbelief, insult, a flash of old pain. Her mouth opened. "Madam, I don't think." "There's no time to think," Eleanor interrupted, her politeness shredding under the strain. "This is what we are doing. It's this, or the entire evening is a ruin. Do you understand?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and strode back towards the chattering crowd in the main room, leaving Lena alone by the silent, shining piano. Lena stood there, the soft cloth crumpled in her fist. She looked from the empty bench to the doorway, where her employer had vanished. The weight of the request, its sheer, breathtaking audacity, pressed down on her. She was to be a prop, a silent, pretending prop in a dress meant for cleaning, not for performing. The first hot prick of shame touched her cheeks. But underneath it, something else stirred, something quiet and fierce and long buried. The head butler appeared, his face grim. He had overheard. "You heard Mrs. van der Linden," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Take your seat. And for heaven's sake, don't touch the keys." He turned and walked to the front of the platform. He cleared his throat. The conversations in the main room began to hush, heads turning expectantly towards the ballroom, ready for the announcement of the great Alexei Volkov. Lena, her heart pounding a hard, slow rhythm against her ribs, walked the few steps to the piano bench. She smoothed her dull gray dress. She sat down, her back painfully straight. Before her stretched the vast, beautiful battlefield of black and white keys. They seemed to wait, not in silence, but in a breathless, humming potential she had sworn never to awaken. She placed her rough, work-worn hands lightly in her lap, as instructed. She was to be a statue, a joke, a desperate woman's secret shame. Out front, the butler's voice rang out, tight with tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, there has been a last-minute change to tonight's program." The butler's voice cut through the pleasant hum of the party like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, there has been a last-minute change to tonight's program. The esteemed Mr. Volkov is regrettably indisposed." A wave of disappointed noise rolled through the crowd. It was a low murmur of surprise, sharpened by the click of dissatisfaction. People who had paid a small fortune for their plates, who had spent all week boasting to friends about hearing the great Volkov in such an intimate setting, felt cheated. Eleanor van der Linden stood at the edge of the room, her face a perfect mask of calm regret. But her knuckles were white where she gripped her champagne flute. The butler pressed on, the words clearly tasting bitter in his mouth. "In the spirit of the evening, and to present something truly unique, we offer an impromptu modern performance, a contemplation on expectation and presence." He stepped aside, revealing the platform and the grand piano. And there, seated at the bench, was Lena. For a long second, there was only confusion. The guests blinked. They saw the simple gray dress, so stark against the piano's polished black. They saw the severe bun, the posture that was stiff, not poised. This wasn't an artist. This was the help. The silence deepened, thickening from confusion into something heavier, more awkward. Then, a woman in a silver gown near the front let out a little, breathy sound that was almost a laugh. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was the spark that lit the fuse. Is this a joke? A man in a tuxedo whispered to his wife, not bothering to keep his voice down. His tone was flat, annoyed. He'd come for world-class art, not some parlor tricked out another guest. An older gentleman with a face used to getting its way simply scowled and turned his back, focusing on refilling his glass from a passing tray. The dismissive turn of his shoulders was louder than any word. Eleanor watched the reactions like someone watching a ship slowly sink. Her plan, which had seemed so clever in her panic, now felt incredibly foolish. She saw the pointed fingers. Not many, just a few, but they were like arrows. A woman gestured subtly with her chin toward the platform, raising an eyebrow at her companion, as if to say, "Asterisk, can you believe this?" A younger man smirked, nudging his friend and nodding toward Lena's practical, flat shoes visible beneath the piano. The room was filled with a polite, poisonous bafflement. They weren't booing. People of their class didn't boo. They just let their disappointment hang in the air, cold and quiet. They let their eyes do the talking. Those eyes swept over Lena, taking in every detail of her working clothes, and their message was clear. You do not belong there. On the platform, Lena felt every single look. The heat of their stares was a physical weight on her skin. The few giggles from the back of the room sounded like gunshots to her ears. She kept her eyes fixed on the music rack in front of her, which was empty. No sheets of complex, beautiful notes. Just bare, polished wood. She had been told to pretend, to move her hands without making a sound, to be a living sculpture of a pianist. The shame was a hot flush that started in her chest and crawled up her neck. It wasn't just the shame of being laughed at, though that was bad enough. It was a deeper, older shame. It was the shame of 1,000 small dismissals across a lifetime, all condensed into this single terrible moment. The way people looked past her in the hallway, the snapped orders, the assumption that because her hands scrubbed floors, they were incapable of anything else. All of that was in the air now, in the sneers and the whispers. She thought about standing up, just getting off the bench, walking off the platform, and disappearing into the kitchen where she belonged. Let Eleanor van der Linden explain her failed, silly art piece. The urge to flee was a strong, trembling feeling in her legs. But then, as she sat there drowning in their quiet scorn, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a dramatic click, just a slow, solid settling. A kind of cold anger, not hot and flashy, but deep and still. This piano, this beautiful, cared-for instrument, was not a prop. It was not a piece of furniture in a joke. It was a world. And they wanted her to mock it. They wanted her to pretend, to make a hollow pantomime of the thing that had once been her entire life. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the empty music rack, lowered. They fell upon the keys. 88 black and white teeth, waiting. They were not just ivory and ebony. They were a landscape. They were hills and valleys, storm clouds and quiet streams. They were the only home her heart had ever truly known. Long before this mansion, long before this country, long before this gray dress, the butler, standing stiffly to the side, gave her a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. It was time to begin the charade. He expected her to lift her hands and hover them over the keys, mimicking movement. Lena took a breath. But it wasn't the small, shaky breath of a nervous maid. It was a deep, filling breath that lifted her shoulders and stilled the tremble in her hands. She drew the air of the room, with all its judgment and its perfume and its tension, deep into her lungs. She did not look at the guests. She did not look at Eleanor, who was now watching with a kind of horrified fascination. She looked only at the keys. Her hands, those rough, work-worn hands that knew the weight of a scrub brush and the grain of polished wood, came up from her lap. They didn't hover. They moved to a familiar starting position, her fingers curling with a natural, unthinking grace that no one in the room expected. The man who had turned his back took a sip of his drink, still annoyed. The woman in the silver gown leaned over to whisper another cutting remark to her friend. Then Lena's hands fell. The sound was not a delicate tinkle. It was not the tentative, searching note of a beginner. It was a deep, resonant, and profoundly sorrowful chord that came from the very bottom of the piano. It was a low, thunderous vibration that didn't just hit the ears. It hit the chest. It felt like the first rumble of a coming storm. Every whisper died instantly. It was as if the sound had physically reached out and snatched the words from their mouths. The man with his back turned froze, the glass halfway to his lips. The woman in silver sat bolt upright, her witty remark forgotten. The chord hung in the stunned silence, vibrating in the wood of the floor, in the crystal of the chandeliers. Before it could fade completely, Lena's right hand moved. It flew across the keys in a dark, cascading waterfall of notes, a haunting, unmistakable melody that was both powerful and desperately sad. The left hand answered with a slow, marching rhythm. Like a heavy heart beating dot, it was Rachmaninoff. The prelude in C-sharp minor. Not the easy, popular bits, but the complex, demanding soul of it. And she wasn't just playing the notes. She was pulling the emotion straight from the piano's heart. The music was stormy, anguished, full of a longing so deep it seemed to swallow the room. Got no one moved. No one breathed. The pointed fingers had dropped. The sneers had melted away, replaced by looks of pure, uncomprehending shock. Eleanor van der Linden's champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It didn't shatter. It landed with a soft thud on the thick carpet, the golden liquid soaking in unnoticed. Her hand remained in the air, frozen in the shape of holding it. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, all her poise and planning shattered by the sheer, undeniable power coming from the platform. The butler's professional mask had completely crumbled. He stared at Lena as if he had never seen her before. And in a way, he hadn't. Lena played on. She was no longer in the Van der Linden ballroom. She was somewhere else. In a small, cold room overlooking a different city. At a different piano, with someone who smelled of pipe smoke and kindness standing beside her, nodding. She was playing for ghosts, for lost time, for a life that had been interrupted by war and loss and hard, silent years. Every ounce of that loss, every bit of the quiet strength it took to keep going, poured into the music. Her face, which had been a blank mask of shame, was now alive with concentration, with a deep, painful remembering that transformed her. She wasn't a maid anymore. In that moment, she was completely, unforgettably, an artist, and the room, which had been so full of noise and judgment, was now perfectly, utterly silent. They weren't just quiet. They were silenced, held captive not by social obligation, but by awe. The only sound in the entire vast mansion was the piano weeping, thundering, singing a truth none of them had been prepared to hear. The first crashing wave of music didn't just quiet the room. It emptied it. It swept away the glitter, the perfume, the quiet judgments, and left only the sound. For those first few seconds, the shock was so complete that people didn't even process what they were hearing. They simply felt it. The low notes vibrated in the floorboards, up through the soles of expensive shoes. The complex chords seemed to change the air pressure in the room, making it thick and hard to breathe. The man who had turned his back slowly, as if moving through deep water, turned around again. His face, which had been set in a scowl of annoyance, was now blank with disbelief. He wasn't looking at the woman in the maid's dress anymore. He was staring at her hands. They were a blur, yet every movement was precise, powerful. They flew from the deep, growling bass notes to the middle of the keyboard, building a structure of sound. It was both heavy and delicate. He knew a little about music. He knew this piece was famously difficult, a monster for the fingers. And this woman, this maid, was not just playing it. She was conquering it. The woman in the silver gown had forgotten to be cruel. Her hand, which had been raised to cover a mocking whisper, now just hung in the air near her cheek. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the figure at the piano. The music was telling a story, a sad and stormy story, and against her will, she was pulled into it. She thought of a loss in her own life, a private grief she kept polished and hidden like a piece of jewelry she never wore. The music found that grief and touched it. A single perfect tear escaped her eye and traced a path through her powder. She didn't wipe it away. On the platform, Lena was gone. The ballroom, the guests, the crushing weight of their expectations. It had all dissolved. Her world had shrunk to the space between her mind and her fingers. The piano was no longer an object. It was an extension of her body, her memory, her very breath. She wasn't thinking about the notes. Her muscles, trained in another lifetime, remembered. They remembered the cold studio, the relentless metronome, the feeling of her teacher's gentle hand adjusting her wrist. Not from the fingers, from the arm. Let the weight fall. Good. Now feel it. The sadness isn't in the loud parts. It's in the space between the sounds. The piece swelled, a great angry wave of sound that filled every corner of the mansion. Pictures on the wall seemed to rattle in their frames. Then, just as suddenly, it pulled back. Lena's left hand kept a slow, fateful heartbeat, while her right hand picked out a lonely, wandering melody high up the keys. The sound was so clear, so painfully beautiful, it made your throat ache. It was the sound of someone walking alone in an empty place, remembering. A waiter had been frozen in the act of offering a tray of shrimp cocktails. He stood there, his arm extended, utterly still. He was a young man, studying engineering at night school. The music meant something different to him. It wasn't about society or art. It was the sound of his own exhaustion, the relentless pressure of work and study, the lonely walk home in the dark. He looked at the woman playing, really looked at her. He saw the lines around her eyes, the strength in her shoulders, the rough skin on her hands. He saw someone who understood hard work, who understood silence. For the first time all night, he felt like he was in the presence of something real. Eleanor van der Linden finally remembered to close her mouth. The shock was turning into a slow, sickening understanding. She had been so wrong. So terribly, stupidly wrong. This wasn't a servant she could order to pretend. This was an artist she had somehow employed to clean her toilets. The magnitude of her own blindness made her feel dizzy. She had looked at this woman every day for years and seen only a uniform, a function. She had never seen a person, and she had certainly never imagined this. Her eyes darted around the room. She saw the faces, all turned toward the piano, lit up with awe. They were feeling something true, something real, in her house. And she, the hostess, had had no part in creating it. In fact, she had tried to prevent it. She had tried to turn it into a joke. A hot shame, far deeper than any social embarrassment, washed over her. She had offered these people a fake, silent performance because she thought that was all the woman at the piano was capable of. The music was now a mirror, and it was showing her a reflection of herself she did not want to see. The head butler had taken a small, involuntary step back. Every rule of his profession screamed that this was disorder. A maid was at the center of attention, commanding the room. But a deeper, human feeling had knocked all the rules aside. He remembered finding Lena in the music room sometimes late, when she thought everyone was gone. She wouldn't be playing. She would just be standing there, looking at the piano, her cleaning rag in her hand. He had thought she was simply admiring the furniture. Now he understood. She had been visiting an old friend. A wave of strange guilt hit him. He had been the one to usher her to the bench like a prisoner to the dock. The music built again, faster now, more urgent. It was a turbulent, rushing river of notes. Lena's body moved with it, a slight, rocking motion from her core. A strand of steel-gray hair had escaped her tight bun and fell along her cheek. She didn't push it away. Sweat gleamed on her temple. This was physical, this work. It was pouring every ounce of her strength, her memory, her lost years into the keys. For the guests, the performance had become a shared secret. The pointed fingers and sneers of 10 minutes ago now seemed like a distant, ugly dream. No one dared to look at each other. To look away from the piano felt like it might break the spell. They were all alone together, each person wrapped in their own private world, connected only by the thread of this heartbreakingly beautiful sound. The final section of the piece arrived. It was a return of the storm, but darker now, more resigned. The powerful chords crashed like waves against a cliff. Then came the famous slow descent, a series of deep, bell-like notes, falling, like something sinking into deep water. Each note was spaced apart, heavy with finality. The room held its breath. Lena played the last, deep, echoing chord. She held the pedal down, letting the sound bloom and then fade into a ringing silence. She kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed. Her shoulders rose and fell with a single deep breath. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the silence of scorn or confusion. It was a full, thick, respectful silence. It was the silence of people who have been given a gift they know they didn't deserve and have no idea how to accept it. The air itself felt charged, used up. No one clapped. Clapping felt wrong, too small, too cheap for what had just happened. It would be like applauding a sunset or a prayer. The woman in the silver gown finally wiped the tear from her cheek. The man with the drink slowly lowered his glass to a table, his movements careful, as if afraid to make a noise. All eyes were still on Lena, waiting. For what? They didn't know. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the keyboard. She placed them in her lap, just as they had been at the start. The transformation was over. The artist was receding, and the woman in the gray dress was returning. She finally lifted her head. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with a kind of quiet exhaustion, a peace. She looked out at the sea of faces, not with fear or shame, but with a simple, weary calm. She had spoken, and the room had nothing left to say. The silence after the final note was its own kind of sound. It was a living, breathing thing, full of the echoes of the music that had just torn through the room. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if they were all afraid that the smallest motion would shatter the feeling that had settled over them. Like fine dust after an explosion. Lena sat with her hands in her lap, looking at them as if she didn't quite recognize them. They tingled. The rough skin on the fingertips felt hot against the wool of her dress. The deep, familiar ache was settling into her knuckles and wrists, an old friend she hadn't visited in years. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a slow, steady drum after the storm. She didn't look up. Looking up meant seeing them, and she wasn't ready for that yet. The world inside the music had been so vast and private. The world outside was just a room. Then, a single sound broke the spell. It wasn't applause. It was a chair scraping softly against the polished floor. The older gentleman, the one who had first turned his back in disgust, was getting to his feet. His face was serious, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't smile. He simply placed his hands together and began to clap. Not a wild, cheering clap, but a slow, deliberate, deep sound of respect. Clap, clap, clap. It was like a signal. As if they had all been waiting for permission, the entire room erupted. The sound was shocking after the quiet. It was a roar. It wasn't the polite patter of applause that follows a decent performance. This was a physical wave of noise. People surged to their feet, chairs scraping and knocking back. Their faces were alight, not with social smiles, but with raw, unfiltered amazement. They were clapping for the music, yes, but they were clapping for the shock, for the story they had just witnessed without knowing a single word of it. The woman in the silver gown was on her feet, clapping so hard her palms stung, the earlier tear tracks still visible. The young waiter had forgotten his tray entirely. He just stood and clapped, a wide, honest grin on his face. The head butler, his training completely overridden, found himself bringing his hands together, the crisp sound lost in the thunder. Lena finally looked up. The wall of standing people, their faces turned toward her with this fierce approval, was overwhelming. It was too much. A hot flush climbed her neck again, but this time it wasn't shame. It was a confusion of feelings: embarrassment, a flicker of pride, and a deep, weary urge to escape. She had played for the ghosts in her memory, not for this. Her eyes found Eleanor van der Linden. The hostess was still standing by the spilled champagne, but she was clapping too. Her movements were slower, more mechanical. Her eyes, locked with Lena's, held a complex storm. Oh, yes, but underneath it, a horrified dawning, a profound and public mortification. She had been the architect of this evening, and her main building block had been a mistake of catastrophic proportion. She clapped because everyone was clapping, because not to clap would be even worse. But each clap seemed to cost her something. The applause didn't die down. It went on, demanding something more. Someone from the back of the room, a man with a loud, enthusiastic voice, shouted, "Bravo!" "Encore!" The cry was taken up by others. "Encore! Yes, please." Lena shook her head, a small, tight movement. This wasn't what she wanted. An encore was for concerts, for planned events. This had been an accident, a bubble from the past that had risen and burst. She made a move to stand, to slide off the bench and flee to the quiet, dark kitchen. But the crowd's energy was a force of its own. They weren't letting her go. They were leaning forward, willing her to stay. And in the front row, a man was moving. He was in his 60s, with a kind, intelligent face and glasses. He wasn't clapping anymore. He was walking slowly, carefully, toward the platform. He was a well-known music critic, a man whose words could make or break careers in the city's papers. He moved with a quiet purpose that parted the energy in the room. He stopped at the edge of the platform, looking up at her. The applause, seeing this, began to falter and drop away, replaced by a new, curious silence. This was becoming something else. A conversation. "Please," the critic said. His voice was soft but carried in the quiet room. "Please don't go yet." He paused, searching for words. What we just heard. That was not just playing. That was a life. Where? Forgive me for asking so directly. Where did a soul like yours learn to speak in such a language? All the air seemed to leave the room again. This was the question hanging in every mind. The guests leaned in, ears straining. The waiters stopped pretending to work. Eleanor van der Linden held her breath. Lena looked at the man. He had kind eyes. He wasn't asking to be cruel or to trap her. He seemed to genuinely want to know. The urge to run was still there, a tight knot in her stomach. But she had already done the hard thing. She had already played. Speaking, in comparison, felt smaller. She took a breath, the same deep breath she took before playing. She looked past the critic, over the heads of the crowd, to a distant point on the wall. It was easier to speak to that spot. There was a conservatory, she began, her voice low and slightly accented, a roughness to it from lack of use in this way. It was a voice for giving simple answers to simple questions. Asterisk, yes, madam. No, sir. Right away. Asterisk, it sounded strange speaking these words. In Leningrad. A long time ago. Before the name changed back. A ripple went through the crowd. Leningrad. The word carried weight, a history of cold and struggle in art. My teacher, she continued. The words coming slowly, like stones pulled from deep water. He was a student of the old school. Very strict. He said music was not in the fingers. It was in here. She tapped her chest lightly with a closed fist. He said you must have something to say, or the notes are just noise. She paused, swallowing. The memory was a physical pain, sweet and sharp. I was to graduate, to perform. Then, her eyes lost their focus on the distant wall, seeing something else entirely. Then the walls came down, and then other walls went up. There was trouble, danger. Nothing was stable. We lost everything. My family, we came here. For safety. For quiet. She looked down at her hands, resting on the gray wool of her dress. Here, I needed work. The hands, they needed to do something useful. This was useful. She said it so simply. This was useful. Cleaning, polishing, serving. The sheer, staggering scale of the change from the concert halls of Leningrad to the silent, unseen corridors of this mansion left people breathless. The woman in silver put a hand over her mouth. The critic nodded slowly, his face full of a deep, sad understanding. And you never played? All these years? Lena shook her head. Not to play. Not really. To play. It opens a door. Behind that door are too many things. It is easier to keep it closed. She looked at the piano beside her, her gaze gentle. But sometimes I would come in here, late. I would play one note, just to hear it, to remember the sound of it. Eleanor van der Linden felt those words like a physical blow. She would come in here, late. How many times had she passed the closed door of the music room, never once wondering what might be happening inside? The woman's entire hidden life, her immense, tragic talent, had been unfolding in the shadows of her own home, and she had been blind to it. The critic took a step closer. What you did tonight. You opened the door. For all of us. Thank you. This seemed to break a dam. People started moving forward, not in a rush, but in a slow, respectful tide. They surrounded the platform, not as an excited mob, but as individuals humbled by what they had witnessed. An older woman, a famous philanthropist, reached out and gently touched Lena's arm. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in this house, she said, her voice thick. The young waiter, emboldened by the moment, said, You made me think of my mom. Thank you. The questions came, soft and urgent. Do you teach? Will you play again? Have you any recordings? Lena answered with short, quiet nods or shakes of her head, overwhelmed by the attention, by the sheer presence of so many people seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Through the small crowd, Eleanor finally moved. She walked slowly, people parting for her automatically. She stopped in front of the platform, looking up at Lena. The distance between them, employer and employee, hostess and maid, had been obliterated by the music. Now, there was just two women in a room full of people. Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she possibly say? Sorry was a pebble against a mountain. After a long moment, she simply said, I did not know. Lena looked at her, and for the first time, her gaze was direct and clear. No, she said softly. You are not meant to. It was not said with anger or bitterness. It was just a fact, simple and devastating. Eleanor felt the truth of it settle into her bones. She had not been meant to know because she had never thought to look. The critic, seeing Lena's growing fatigue, intervened. He pulled a small, elegant card case from his jacket. My card, he said, pressing it into her hand. Please, when you are ready, just call. Not for a newspaper. For me, I know people. The world should hear this. The real world. Lena looked at the small rectangle of cardstock in her hand. It felt alien. A lifeline thrown from a shore she had left behind decades ago. She didn't know if she wanted to swim toward it. But for the first time in a very, very long time, the choice, terrifyingly, was hers. The crowd around the piano did not want to let her go. They were like people who had stumbled upon a spring in a desert, desperate for one more drop of the clear, cool water they hadn't known they needed. The questions and the compliments washed over Lena in a gentle, persistent wave. She answered with quiet nods, a few soft "thank you." Her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, the critic's card a sharp corner pressing into her palm. Finally, the head butler's training reasserted itself. He saw the slight, glazed look in her eyes, the way her shoulders were beginning to curl inward, retreating from all the attention. He moved through the guests with a new kind of authority. "Please, ladies and gentlemen, a little space, thank you. Perhaps we can adjourn for some air in the garden." He said it firmly, but with a deep respect in his tone that had never been there before when speaking about her. The guests, remembering their own manners, began to slowly drift back, leaving her room. The critic gave her one last, meaningful look and a small bow of his head before turning away. The spell was breaking, and the ordinary world was seeping back in. But it was a different world now. Lena stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt unsteady, not from weakness, but from the strange shift back to reality. The platform seemed higher now, the step down to the main floor a bigger distance. She took a deep, quiet breath and stepped down. The simple gray dress felt like a costume now, one she was ready to take off. She walked, not toward the kitchen, but across the ballroom, toward the main hall and the grand staircase that led to the upper floors and the private quarters. No one stopped her. They watched her go, their conversations hushed. She was no longer a piece of the scenery. She was a person, and she was leaving the stage. Eleanor van der Linden watched her go, a knot of complicated feelings in her chest. She knew she should say something, do something, but every possible action felt wrong, too little and too late. Instead, she turned to her remaining guests, her hostess mask clicking back into place, but it was cracked. Her smile was strained, her charm brittle. "Some more champagne, everyone?" She offered, but the magic of her party was gone. The only magic had walked out in a maid's dress. Upstairs, the mansion was quiet. The noise from the party was a distant murmur. Lena didn't go to the small, plain room that was hers in the staff wing. She went to the music room. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, closing it behind her, leaning against it for a moment. The silence here was different. It was a friendly silence, full of the memory of music, not the empty silence of a room that was only for show. She walked over to the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the gardens below. Her heart was still beating that slow, heavy rhythm. She uncurled her fingers and looked at the critic's card in her hand. The name was printed in crisp, professional letters. A phone number, an email, a gateway. For so many years, her life had been about closing doors, closing the door on the past, closing the door on the music, closing the door on the person she used to be, because that person didn't fit in this new, safe, narrow life. It had been a life of quiet necessity, and there had been a kind of peace in that simplicity. No expectations, no stages, no eyes watching. Tonight, she had blown every door off its hinges. She thought of her teacher, the old man in Leningrad with his sharp eyes and gentle hands. He had told her she had a gift, but that a gift was also a burden. It demanded to be used. She had chosen, for what felt like good reasons, to set that burden down, to pretend it didn't exist. But it had been there all along, sleeping inside her, growing heavier with every year of silence. Downstairs, the party was attempting to recover. The conversation was louder now, fueled by shock and champagne. Everyone was talking about it. Did you see her hands? Leningrad. Imagine. Eleanor had a world-class pianist cleaning her silver. This last one was whispered. A delicious, scandalous morsel. Eleanor heard these whispers. They were like insects buzzing around her ears. She excused herself and walked to her private study, closing the door. She poured a glass of brandy, not for taste, but for something to hold on to. She stood in the middle of the rich carpet, utterly alone. The house, her beautiful, perfect house, felt different. It felt like it had been hiding a secret from her, and the secret had been more valuable than the house itself. She thought of the way Lena had looked at her. Asterisk, you are not meant to know. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was the simple truth of being unseen. Eleanor had built her identity on seeing everything, the right art, the right people, the right wine. And she had been blind to the masterpiece living under her own roof, polishing her furniture. She knew with a cold certainty that Lena would not stay. How could she? The balance was broken. You cannot ask a lion to go back to sleeping by the fireplace once it has remembered the Savannah down in the kitchen. The staff was abuzz. The young waiter was telling the cook, his hands flying. You should have heard it. It was like thunder, but sad thunder. And then she just talked, so quiet, about the war and everything. The head butler shushed them, but there was no real force behind it. He was polishing a glass, over and over, his mind far away. The next morning, the mansion was heavy with the quiet that comes after a big event. The cleaning staff was already at work, erasing all traces of the gala. Lena was up at her usual time. She put on her everyday dress, not the party one. She went through her usual motions, but they felt distant, like she was watching someone else do them. Eleanor sent for her just before noon. Lena knocked on the study door and entered. Eleanor was seated at her desk. The two women looked at each other across a vast space that had nothing to do with the fine Persian rug between them. Please, Eleanor said, her voice strangely formal. Sit. Lena sat, her back straight, her hands folded. Eleanor struggled. The words she had practiced sounded hollow in her head. Last night? It was extraordinary. She paused. I owe you an apology. A very large one. Lena waited. She wasn't going to make it easier. I had no idea, Eleanor continued. I treated you. I treated a gift with disrespect. For that, I am deeply ashamed. She took a breath. Your position here, it is, of course, yours for as long as you wish. But I imagine you may not wish it for long. Lena nodded slowly. I think, she said, her voice quiet but clear, that chapter is finished. Eleanor nodded, a sharp pain of confirmation in her chest. The gentleman last night, the critic. He gave you his card? Yes, he is a good man. His word carries weight. If you decided to play again, he could help. Eleanor wasn't used to feeling helpless. She wanted to offer something, to fix something, but there was nothing to fix. Only something to release. I know, Lena said. There was another long silence. The sun streamed in through the window, highlighting the dust motes in the air. What will you do? Eleanor asked finally. Lena looked out the window. For the first time in a very long time, a question about the future didn't bring a tightness to her chest. It brought a faint, unfamiliar flutter. Not excitement, not yet, but possibility. A door had been opened, and she could feel a draft from the other side. I will call the number, she said. I will talk to him, and then I will see. She looked back at Eleanor. I will need to leave by the end of the week. It was done. Eleanor simply nodded. Of course. Anything you need. Lena stood up to leave. At the door, she stopped and turned. The piano, she said. It is a very fine instrument. You should have someone play it. It shouldn't be so quiet. Then she was gone. A week later, Lena packed a single suitcase. It didn't hold much. She left the gray dresses in the wardrobe. The staff gathered to say goodbye, not as a servant leaving, but as a person they were in awe of. The young waiter shook her hand, serious and respectful. The head butler, for the first time, called her by her name. "Good luck, Lena," he said, and he meant it. She did not look back at the mansion on the hill. She took a bus downtown to a small apartment that critics' friends had helped her find. It was modest, but it had a window. And in the corner, rented for her through a special fund set up by some of the guests from that night, was a small, used upright piano. It wasn't a majestic Steinway. It was scratched, and a few of the keys had a faint buzz. But it was hers. She sat down on the stool, which creaked. She placed her hands on the keys. They felt the same. They were still her hands. She didn't play Rachmaninoff. She didn't play anything grand or stormy. She played a simple, old folk melody from her childhood, something her grandmother used to hum. The notes were soft, a little rusty, but they were true. Down in the mansion, Eleanor had the grand piano tuned. She hired a music student from the city conservatory to come and play it once a week. She would sometimes sit in the room and listen. The music was nice, skillful even, but the room never again held that breathless, life-changing silence. That silence, she understood now, had never been in the room at all. It had been in the woman, and the woman was gone, finally making her own music, on her own terms, in the quiet of a new room, with the future, for the first time in decades, waiting quietly in the wings.